We need to go for a higher source. That higher source has a definition of love. The higher source has a definition of love. Now, what I'm going to propose to you, that it being a higher source, you would assume that the definition of love varies greatly from the definition of love that we actually have, that we actually believe to be true. Now, this is, for the majority of you, the major problem. You still keep defining love the way the world defines it. As a result, when it comes to God's love, you're going to feel lots of different things, but mostly disappointment, because God does not define love the same way as the world does, and you want God's love to be defined the same way as the world does. And we'll talk about that as to why that's the case later as well. But this is the issue. We need to also come to accept this source's definition of love. That is going to mean giving up our own definition of love. And that's going to be a potentially painful process, because most of us are addicted to holding on to this definition of love that is out of harmony with what I would classify with peace and joy and love itself, happiness. In fact, if we look at the world's definition of love, it's created a lot of pain and suffering. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, lots of pain and suffering has been created by the world's definition of love. So it's quite obvious we need to change our own definition of love. Now that's quite difficult, isn't it? Because we have a very fixed definition of love before we begin, based on what's happened to us in the world. And we believe that to be true when it's not true. Not only do we believe it to be true, we have an emotional investment in it being true. And the main reason why we have that is because we have associated our worth with what we now know. Do all of you get that? What you've done is you've joined what you think you know as a measure of your value as a person. So what you've done inside of yourself emotionally is you believe your value as a person is measured by what you know. Now, if what you know is completely false from God's perspective, from the higher source's perspective, then can you see whenever you receive something that you don't know, you're going to see it as an attack on your worth. This is how many of you respond to truth. You see truth as an attack on your worth, because you've become invested between what you know and what you're worth, and you've joined the two together. Now, when I say you've done that, for the majority of you, it's not you that necessarily has done that. It's the education system we have on this planet that has done that. The education system on this planet is basically punitive or rewarding only, and it's based upon how you perform. It's based upon measuring you constantly and how you perform based on what you know. It's got nothing to do with love at all. It's got everything to do with what kind of head knowledge you can absorb and regurgitate. That's all that's got anything to do. And so you then become addicted to this concept that the more head knowledge I have, the more I know, the more I'm worth something, the better I am as a person. Not true. From God's perspective, a child, a baby in the arms who knows nothing is just as worthy, has just as much worth as you do. So what does that tell me? That tells me that from God's perspective, God doesn't care what you know. That's what it tells me. You're still worth something whether you know nothing or everything. Now, knowing everything from God's perspective is also an impossibility for you, because then you'd be God, right? And only God knows everything. So get used to not knowing much. It's okay. And also, it's not associated with your worth. So when you hear things that are beyond what you know and understand, do not believe that your worth is getting attacked, because it's not. It's just new knowledge, new truth being presented to you, that's all. right? And you're still worth as much as you ever were, no matter how much you know, from God's perspective. So this is part of God's definition of love, in fact, that worth is not equal to what you know. God loves you and thinks you're worthy even if you know nothing. Isn't that wonderful? Yes? Of course, feeling that in the world in which we live is very difficult, because the world in which we live basically is saying to you, unless you know something, you're not worth very much. And the world tells you that until you're dead. Many of you now believe that to be true, that you're not worth very much because you don't know much. Many of you will listen to people who are totally unloving just because they tell you they know more. Many of you do that too. In other words, you'll be emotionally manipulated through this thing that's been established in your childhood, this belief that worth equals knowledge. You are now often getting emotionally manipulated by people who are presenting that to you constantly. The more you know, the more you're worth, the more value you have. And it's not true. So bearing that in mind, you can see what we're attempting to do with these sessions with you. What we're attempting to do, number one thing that we need to attempt to do, is to help you connect to the source of all knowledge and all truth and all love. We need to do that. Because without doing that, everything that you can potentially learn is only what the world has already learnt. You can't learn anything more from anybody who's at the same level as you are or in a similar state than you are. So at the end of the day, you're just going to know what the world has known for thousands of years. And, you know, as the world progresses in its collective knowledge, so too will you. But that's a long-winded process, and not only that, it has caused so much pain and suffering already. Surely we've got to find a different way of getting educated, particularly when it comes to our education in love. Right? So having this realization is very important. This realization that God is the source of my education. It then becomes imperative that I connect to this source somehow, so that I can get educated. That needs to be my focus. And also I need to forget about what I currently know as if it's got anything to do with what my value is. Because from God's perspective, your value is immensely high. You are the pinnacle of God's creation, whether you're a baby in arms who knows nothing, or whether you're a 70 or 80-year-old adult who knows very little more than nothing. From God's perspective. Yeah? Well, you think about it. An infinite being must know a lot, right? So obviously we know very little even when we're 70 or 80 years of age. 2,000 years of age, you still know very little. Is that disappointing? Well, not really, because God's created this beautiful process in us that we will always, once we get rid of this worth linking to knowledge, we will become passionate about discovery again. See, many of you have lost your passion of discovery of truth. When you were a little tiny child, it was beaten out of you a lot of the times. And if not beaten out of you, it was ostracized out of you, ridiculed out of you, and a number of other things, techniques that are used to pull you into line with the world's definition. And from God's perspective, you need to rediscover that. You need to rediscover this joy of finding out, right? And the beauty of rediscovering that is you have that for the rest of your existence. 2,000 years' time, you'll still have it. 10,000 years' time, you'll still have it. You'll still be discovering new things, finding out new things. The most rapid way, of course, for you to do so is by connecting to the source of this knowledge and information. So, we want to make sure that we are willing to address the fact that our definition of love is probably severely flawed. We also need to address the issue that unless we get an education from a higher source with love, then it's highly likely that any education we receive is not going to have very much long-term benefit to us. So that's what we need to understand. Now, what we've tried to do with this program, which goes over, last night I said to you, it's over 250 hours of information that you'll be presented with. What we're trying to do with this program is to introduce you, firstly, to the reasons why you find it difficult to connect to the source, to actually go through the process of connecting to the source, to work through all the things that prevent you from connecting to that source, and then eventually, hopefully, you get to the point where you do connect to the source and are able to be educated by God directly. Does that make sense? So all we're attempting to do is to educate you with regard to the how to do that, because God has the ability to educate every one of God's children, as long as the child is open to such education. And what the world has done is shut you down from the education process that God designed. That's what it's done. It's shut you down from being educated from the source. And so what we've got to do is reverse that damage, reverse the process that occurred through that damage. That's what we've got to do. We've got to address that as an issue. So